happy to have like the experts on this issue and this topic with us today. So today we'll welcome. So following the lovely conversation about the open science practices in the last year's APOS conference in New Orleans, which seemed like 100 years ago, so we're so excited to continue the discussion on the open science movement in our field of psychology and law. So open science initiatives encourage research transparency and accessibility and have become more widely recognized in our field over the past few years. So today, our experts will discuss new open science initiatives by our flagship journal, Law and Human Behavior, as well as other important advancements. So today's panel is co-sponsored by Law and Human Behavior and the APLS Student Committee. So Kamar and I will be the moderators today. So I'm Amy, and I'm a second-year PhD student in the Department of Human Development at Cornell University.
My name's Kamar. I'm a first-year PhD student in clinical psych at the University of North Texas, and I'm secretary of the APLS Student Committee.
Yeah, and then let's welcome our beloved panelists today. So our first panelist will be Dr. Bradley McLiffe, and he's a professor of psychology at California State University, Northridge, and he's an editor of the Law and Human Behavior.
Hi, folks.
Our next panelist is Dr. Anthony Perillo. He's an assistant professor of psychology and the assistant director of PsyD clinical training at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And he's also an editorial board member for the Open Access Journal of Forensic Psychology.
Thanks a lot.
And our third panelist today is Dr. Jennifer Perillo, and she's an assistant professor of psychology at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and she's also a consulting editor on Law and Human Behavior journal.
Hi. And our fourth panelist is Melanie Fessinger. She's a psychology and law PhD student at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and author of The Movement Towards Open Science.
Yeah. So today our schedule will go like this. First of all, we'll have the first session of the QA, and those questions are pre-compiled by the student committee. And then later on, we will have like a live QA session, and which will open all the opportunities to the audience. So if you have any questions throughout the way, please feel free to type in the chat, and the moderators will ask the question for you. So if anyone don't have any like pressing questions at the moment, we'll start the first session of the QA session. So the first question, which is actually like more specifically a question for Professor McLiffe, is that we know that the Law and Human Behavior recently adopted some open science policies, including the transparency of openness promotion guidelines to improve open science practices among researchers and authors. So what are the biggest challenges the editorial team has been facing regarding implementing the open science policies?
Well, thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to come speak. I assume you can hear me okay, right?
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
Perfect. I think the biggest challenge is being recognized as an expert in open science when really I am honestly just learning this along with everybody else. I think when I took over the journal in 2018, former editor-in-chief Margaret Covera had started some of the initiatives. So we had the badge program. And so part of what I was doing was kind of continuing that and trying to build on it. So I think that the challenge is to implement these practices in a way that isn't overwhelming and in a way that allows us to continue doing the great research we're doing, but hone that so that it comports better with open science practices. And we've just, taken the phased approach of looking over time, how can we start to introduce our researchers and readers who, maybe aren't familiar with it or maybe haven't implemented it in their own research program, and encourage them to start doing that. And so we've started doing that in a piecemeal way.
Yeah, that's really, really wonderful work. And I think it's great for all of us to kind of see it, changing over time with you all. So what are some future directions for open science initiatives in LHB?
Well, my goal, so I believe I try and block this number out, but I believe I have 3 more years of being editor at the journal. And so my goal is really to get us to the point where we are requiring open data and open materials for submissions to Law and Human Behavior. And that seems radical from where we are now, but I think over the next 3 years, we'll start to see that. And I think related to the challenge, right, is that you can't announce you're going to require these things when people have been collecting data on projects for years, maybe not implementing them. So I think, what I want to communicate to everybody there is that there's going to be a transition. And I think we've been flexible with that at the journal. I've even had difficulty working with just the production side of APA to try and kind of figure out, like, what's this going to look like? How are we going to report this information? How are we going to get it from researchers? And so I think, that's my goal, is really just to kind of keep working towards implementing the program so that I'm personally using Psych Science as a role model in terms of what they're doing, because I think the quality of our research is there. I just want to continue to increase that and make sure that that we meet that high bar.
Wow, thanks for all the amazing work that you are doing. I know it's very challenging, but it's just very meaningful and significant. And then the next question is for all the panelists. So we know that all of you are working on different aspects and different work involving the open science work. So can you briefly share some of the open science work you have been involved in, and then see who wants to go first?
Well, Melanie was the last to join the chat, so how about she goes first?
Sure.
I guess I'll take this question. So we currently, some of you probably recently got a lot of annoying invitation emails from us because we're currently doing a survey to try and understand how our field is using psychology, or how the field of psychology and law is using open science. So we recently finished data collection on that project, and hopefully we'll have some data to share in the near future. So the main project that we're doing right now involving open science is just really trying to figure out what our field is doing with it and where there might be barriers and how we might be able to overcome those barriers, and see if there's any misconceptions that need to be clarified or specific things that can be done in our field to try and make the transition towards the open science movement.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think a lot of this discussion as well has, some of this started a little over a year ago. Jen and some people in the other APLS committee started a talk at the last live APLS conference in New Orleans, and where some of us talked about our different uses of open science. And so part of this has just been getting the conversation going, and what is open science, what it's not, and just getting people more familiar with it so that as we talk more and more about the different areas and different ways that people can contribute to open science, that we can address some of the myths that are out there about it, and also start to get into more of these more advanced issues that as people start to implement more and more, we have these maybe hiccups or potential other questions that we can address. We can't get there until people know what this practice is in the first place.
Yeah, and to build off of that, part of that is also making sure that our students know about it. So, a big part of that is also integrating teaching of open science, not only at the graduate level, but at the undergraduate level as well. So that's been something that I've particularly paid a lot of attention to, is trying to kind of expand that and working in with other organizations that try to work on that aspect as well.
Yeah, kind of similarly to that. When both Jen and I have done this with our students, when we have dissertations that are going to be set up, our policies with our students are to incorporate these practices in order to pre-register their studies. And some of our students haven't been as familiar with that, and at first it can seem a little daunting. And then when we break it down and we go, well, if you think about if anybody here's had a dissertation proposal or a thesis proposal or anything, what are you doing at that point? You are saying ahead of time what you propose to do, why you're going to do it. And sometimes you get these really finite questions of, well, how many participants are you going to get? What's the basis for that? These are all the things that we do already in a more standardized kind of structured form. So implementing that into our standard of how we supervise our research students as well has been something to just make it more familiar to students.
Thank you for those answers. And I think kind of along those lines, we're sort of wondering if any of you in any of the kind of roles that you've had or initiatives you've worked on towards open science, if you've come up against resistance from traditionalists or folks who don't quite understand open science or who might hold misconceptions about it. And if so, kind of how you understood that resistance and how you addressed it.
I think, the other panelists can probably speak about the things they say about the journal and the editor, behind my back, because I don't know that they come to me with those. But I just think, there is a misconception that, that open science is rigid and inflexible. And so I've had, people and my own students that have done, for those of you who haven't done a registered report or pre-registered a study, it takes time and there's a lot of detail and there are important things to do. And since we're all doing this, a lot of us are doing it for the first time, mistakes can be made. And so I think just that fear of I'm going to make a mistake in pre-registering my study and I'm going to be locked into that mistake and it's going to prevent publication or it's going to, the reviewers are going to attack it. I just think that's an important misconception to dispel and to think about. The key is that the information is you're being transparent and that information is accessible. And so, I was working on a manuscript this week at the journal where they had deviated from their pre-registered plan in terms of some issues with manipulation checks. And I think, it's not that you can't do that. It's that you have to make it clear so that the reader is making an informed decision about, is there a possibility for harking? Are there questionable research practices that might be at play? And so I think it just puts the reader in a position where they're more informed and can evaluate the science. Whereas, in the past, we just see this, what seems like a perfect package. And in reality, we're not understanding that a lot of decisions made along the way influence that, what appears to be a perfect package.
I think one of the biggest misconceptions I hear is that open science is going to hinder the ability to do exploratory analyses and to really explore a research problem. And I get the resistance to that in the sense that exploratory research is obviously worthwhile to do, but I don't think that exploratory research and open science are necessarily incompatible. So that's one of the misconceptions I hear a lot, is that if I have to register everything that I'm doing, then I'm not going to be able to do this exploratory stuff. And I think the important distinction is that open science practices are merely supposed to make it transparent which of your analyses and what you're doing is exploratory as opposed to things that you hypothesized in advance. And so I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions we have to butt ahead, in addition to just the huge learning curve that is learning how to do open science practices. So I think that there's a huge learning curve and people might be resistant to that change. And then you hear things like it might limit exploratory analyses or requires more time and effort, when in reality, as Anthony mentioned, it's some time and effort that you're going to put in at some point. You're just doing it up front. And so I think there are some barriers that we have to overcome, but they're not impossible barriers to get across.
Yeah, and I think, part of that also is when you don't necessarily know exactly what your data is going to look like. I think some people sometimes are worried about doing a pre-registration in those sorts of circumstances as well. So for example, you're going to be factor analyzing your data. You don't know what factors are going to necessarily come out. And just like Melanie was saying, the point is to be transparent. Like, I'm going to do this, if I have this many factors, I'll do this. If I end up with one factor, then I'll do this, but just, again, putting that thought in ahead of time about, okay, well, what would I do if I have these different situations come up? It doesn't have to be incompatible. I think go ahead.
Not a completely different track, so keep going.
Mine was too.
Okay. Okay, then I will go. I think one particular obstacle, particularly for students at this point, has some weight to it, is that because certain decision makers and people that will evaluate you for whether it is to enter a doctorate program or to enter graduate school or to get tenure and all that might be less familiar with these practices. The idea here is what is actually incentivized and what gets rewarded. in academic research. And right now, these practices, for the most part, aren't as incentivized. That a lot of people that are looking at how many publications do you have, what is your citation index and all that, that these extra ideas of what is a registered report, if you put that on your CV, might not get as much credit or be seen as research experience. And then on the flip side, some people that are experienced with this, there's been some discussion about whether, putting extra lines in terms of your registered reports or pre-registrations that haven't been actually produced or completed yet, is that CV padding. These are issues that we have to continue to discuss and have aware for people that actually do judge and assess students, so that if you're engaging in open science practices, you are not unfairly hindered by people that might be less familiar with it or might see it in a different light.
I'd just add, I think one other big one that I've heard happen or come up a lot in our field is simply some data can't be shared openly, right? You have it from protected data sources. For example, you've got a data set of people who are incarcerated, and it's highly sensitive data. You're not allowed to share it because of the agreements that you have in place. That doesn't mean that you can't do open science in other ways, right? You might not be able to share your data, but again, open science is not an all or nothing thing. And I think that's another misconception, is if I can't do one part of it, then there's no point in doing any of it. And that's just not true. You can still do a great deal of open science, even if you can't do every single element.
Bradley, do you have anything you want to say about this question?
I think we're good. I had something, but it's escaped me at the moment. So how about another prompt?
Sure. So I totally agree. And then imagine that all the challenges you guys have been facing. So here's the question: that if there's a imaginary ideal world that everyone in the field of psychology and law community, they really embrace open science. So what direction would you like to see our field move into that direction?
Well, I think to build on Anthony's point, it's got to work its way through, right? I think it's not just people doing open science; it's how people evaluate it. And one thing I can say from an editorial perspective is that open science is messier. It's. I think people are used to seeing, like I said, kind of this. Perfect is an overstatement, but just this, these were hypothesized and we found this and the measures fit and the findings are there. And the reality is most science doesn't look like that. So when we're being transparent about that science, it's messier. And so I think it's posed some challenge for reviewers and even for our editorial board. But I think, just kind of keeping the philosophy of understanding what it is and how that's actually improving science, right? Because I think a lot of research up to this point, not just in psychology and law, but we know more broadly in social psychology, has promoted a false narrative and even false positive findings. And so I think it's just we're all going to have to kind of recalibrate to what science looks like when we're being honest and transparent and making it accessible to people. And then I think that carries on to Anthony's point about the institutions of the academy and where we're being evaluated, what's important when we're hiring candidates, what's important when we're retaining them and promoting them and giving them tenure. It really is a shift. And so I'm looking forward to seeing it work its way through. And I really do believe, and this isn't me as an editor, but me in realizing how it's improved my own research, we're better off for it. I think we're better off as researchers, and certainly the product that we deliver, which really matters, right? In psychology and law, our research affects people's lives. And I think that the process is going to result in better science that better improves people's lives.
I think it's also important to, sorry, you can go ahead. I think it's also important to consider that, even in this like ideal world that you've created with your question, right, of everybody doing open science practices, that I think open science practices also exist on a spectrum. And so it's not enough to just get everybody to do pre-registrations, because you can put together a pre-registration in 5 minutes, or you could take weeks to put together a pre-registration. And with these kinds of open science practices, you really get out what you put in. And so you could very easily get to a phase where everybody's doing pre-registrations, but are they spending the time that they need to actually do that adequately? And then, okay, so then everybody's at pre-registrations. We've reached that we've passed that hurdle, right? But then the problem is somebody reading those pre-registrations, right? Is somebody actually holding them to what they said they were going to do? And so it really just takes like it's going to require a whole shift in the way that we do science. And I think it's cool to be here now while the open science movement is kind of still developing, but I think that we have a long way to go, in that like even just getting everybody to start doing a pre-registration is not going to be the end. It's going to require a lot of effort, but I think it'll pay off in the long run.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think having access to that kind of information, reviewing open science, like articles that use open science practices, I feel like I do a much better job as a reviewer. And I don't mind the mess. I think that, having that honest look at what was done and what happened is really useful, that I can actually really get in there and see what were they trying to do, what did they do, and what was the result. And I think, being able to really look at that study in a deeper way makes it a lot more meaningful.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, when we start in incorporating open science practices in our research, we can get very enthusiastic and overzealous about this in a sense where we can start to have this misconception that somebody that engages open science means their research is better, that we can trust that research more. But we have to temper those expectations too. Open science lets us see how much we can trust research, not that we can trust it because people engaged in open science practices. So the fact that we engage in open science, we can't lose our eye on the prize that this is also for stronger science. And it's to make sure that we can trust the work that we've done, make sure that it's accessible to all. The other area that I've been thinking about a lot in this, and people have different even definitions of what we mean by open science, and a lot here we've talked about more of the idea of transparency and accessibility, but open science can also mean the inclusiveness of who is represented in work. And so with your question, Amy, about everybody being involved in open science, that also includes everybody being involved, whether they are participants, have access to the work, or are able to collaborate internationally or with people from other labs in a number of different areas, so that we really do include everybody that can have access and can produce work. A lot of people have been putting a number of efforts into increasing that. I know one example that's always stood out to me is Neil Lewis at Cornell, that invested in basically a mobile lab so that he can bring research participants out in the community into research and drive out to areas that aren't going to come into Cornell and participate in a study or not in a Psych 101 class. So examples like that of getting out there so that not only is our research stronger, but it's also stronger from like a purely scientific standpoint, but also stronger for the amount of inclusiveness that it has.
I think, along those lines, thinking about like our position as graduate students and, the many student members we have, do you all have suggestions or things that you've tried yourselves for how to implement graduate student training in open science practices?
I think it's an interesting question from me being a graduate student, because I became involved in this movement towards open science specifically because of my graduate training. So my advisor had a requirement that we pre-register our thesis, and that basically every project that we do in the lab is pre-registered. And so I think that's really how a good way to get people involved in open science, right, is just making those the expectations. And I think as I think Jen mentioned, maybe it doesn't fit every project, every practice doesn't fit for every project, but at least doing a start, right? Like if the project is already ongoing, you might not have IRB approval to do open data, but maybe you could do open materials. Or if you've already collected data, you obviously can't do like a pre-registration, but maybe you can share your data or something like that. It's taking small steps that can eventually get you there. But I think in order to implement it at graduate school level, it's either going to have to be the graduate students doing it themselves, or advisors are going to have to set those expectations. But I think you can trickle it down too. So I taught a research methods course last summer, and I taught my undergrads about open science. So I think it's such a new topic that I think it's just going to require people who really feel passionately about it to start, being on the forefront of passing this around.
Yeah, I had a crash course where one of my very first pre-registrations was with a student who her dissertation proposal, and she pre-registered it, and then decided for fun to see how much we had messed it up. So we pre-registered and then ran the analyses once the data were collected, ran it ourselves without talking to each other based on what we said we were going to do. How were we going to, and all these different things that we had forgot to include or consider ahead of time were there. How were we actually going to code these variables, certain decisions that we were going to make? And so we had like this broad, we're going to analyze it this way. But it, overlooked some of these little steps, and it just really highlighted again this idea that starting that's an encouraging step, but it doesn't automatically mean stronger science. That it really opened the eyes of all these little things that we can really detail in pre-registering a study in order to then down the road make it as consistent and reproducible as possible.
I'll add to what Melanie said. I think Melanie's in the fortunate position where she has a mentor who's on top of that. I think that kind of the traditional model of mentor-mentee changes a little bit, right? And I think that as graduate students, you're going to need to rely on each other, and in some cases, help teach your faculty mentor how to do this, because I think. There's a certain level where you just get I've heard I'm just too old to learn that. And well, that might work for you, but what about the students in your lab? And I just think I would just encourage everybody that if you're not working on that in your lab through your mentor, to seek out resources and to take advantage of them yourself, because I really do believe it's the future of good science. And so to the extent, it is nice, right? It's a convenient excuse to say, well, my mentor didn't teach me it in graduate school. I never really learned it. I'm not going to do it. But that doesn't really, put you at an advantage. It's going to put you behind the curve, I think, eventually. And most of what I know about open science, I learned from Melanie. Melanie is one of my former undergraduate students many years ago, and continuing to work with her has motivated me to learn more about open science. And so I think, don't get comfortable in the traditional mentor-mentee role, because in some cases you're going to be teaching each other, and in other cases you might even be teaching, your crotchety old mentor like Melanie has. So,
yeah, and I would just say, there's also some really great organizations, outside of just the narrow umbrella of psych and law that are putting a lot of resources out about open science and how to do it, and really trying to promote the use of it. So I told the other panelists beforehand that I was going to plug a couple of things. So one is SIPS, the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science, and they've actually got their conference coming up next month, I think. Early bird registration ends tomorrow. But it is a conference that's dedicated towards strengthening the entire field of psychology, and they put a lot of stuff into open science. How do we teach open science? How do we make open science more accessible? As well as creating guidelines for how to implement open science. So how do you create, let's create guidelines for how do you create a data book when you're doing open data, so that everyone can actually see this and understand the data sets that they're getting in a standard way. So I think that's a really great organization to get involved in. Another one, especially for graduate students that are teaching research methods classes, FORT. So that's the Framework for Open and Reproducible Research Training.
Mhm.
And they create a lot of resources for how to teach open science to students. And so they've got lectures available. Someone's made their entire course available on there. So they've got a lot of resources there as well. So stuff that you can use if you want to learn open science yourself, but also that you can use to help teach other people too.
Wow, I learned so much here from your answers. And then, like, following the discussion here, like, because most of our attendees today are like in different years of their PhD or graduate program. So I'm wondering that, like, in regard to all the aspects that you guys from different roles that you are working right now, what are the first step you encourage those graduate students or rising professionals to get engaged in open science if they have never done that before?
Pre-register your next study.
Yeah, and even if you're not comfortable locking in the pre-registration, go through the exercise of. I agree with Melanie, but I would say if that is too big of a step, go through the process of preparing one. I mean, I think we're getting to the point where there are lots of resources that help you do it, and it's interesting because now we're seeing some early pre-registered studies that have some of the gaps that Anthony identified, and are kind of faced with how do you reconcile a manuscript with sloppy isn't a fair word because I don't think it's intentional, but like an incomplete pre-registration. And so I think just start now, and if you're not comfortable with actually doing the pre-registration, prepare one and kind of work through that. And Anthony's example of comparing that to how the process actually plays out is an excellent idea.
Yeah, I'll say from the clinical psychology perspective, there's the Clinical Psychological Science Journal that has had a few special issues, particularly that focus on open science issues in clinical psychology within the past 2 or 3 years. So that'll give a little bit of a crash course, as also just some introductory kind of considerations that people have had in the broader field of clinical psychological science, just to get yourself familiar with it. One of the hopefully the beauties of the open science movement too is that the people that you are familiar with in open science are also tend to be very accessible and open. So if there are any kinds of questions about how to get started on specific things or different considerations, this is all about creating a network and creating an open, connected environment. And so we're happy to talk to you outside of these webinars, whether it's email, Zoom, Twittersphere, whatever it is.
That might be a good time to answer that question in the chat. Since we're talking about pre-registrations, the question is, at what point do we recommend registering a thesis or dissertation, before or after a proposal defense or after IRB approval? My answer to that is your pre-registration should go, like, when you actually register a pre-registration, it should be the last thing you do before you start data collection. So, because things change up until that point, right? The IRB might ask you to make changes to your pre-registration. Your committee might ask you to make changes to your registration. So I always recommend you should draft the pre-registration and you can adjust it as as an IRB goes through or after proposal defense goes through. But you shouldn't pre-register a study until, you shouldn't actually hit pre-register until you're actually ready to launch a study, because things might change until then. And you can still change it later. You can't change the pre-registration itself, but you can still make slight adjustments either by submitting another pre-registration explaining why you're making those changes, or just documenting that you've made changes on later documents. But for that reason, you really should wait until the very end before you're ready to launch a study, before you pre-register it.
And even if you've launched a study, and I definitely agree that that's the point when you should do it, you can still engage in some open science practices, and you can use the open science framework. There is an option when you start to pre-register a study. If you get familiar with that website there's an area that says what stage is the study. And so you do have the option that if you've already collected data but you haven't analyzed anything, you can check that off and be transparent that when I stamped this together, I had started collecting my data already. I hadn't looked at it yet, but I had already started. Even if you've looked at the data, there's an opportunity to there go, yes, I've looked at it, and you can detail this is what I've done at that point. Again, this is all about just being as transparent as possible so people can see how much trust they should put into your work. So it's okay to put that into a pre-registration. We all have to start somewhere. We're all going to make little hiccups along the way. So just getting familiar with the open science framework will just go a long way with that.
And I think it's important to complement open science with some practices that we've done, used before, like pilot testing, making sure our manipulations are working. I think, we've seen pre-registrations that haven't included a fail-safe. So again, kind of at a certain point, you're going to stop, check, make sure things are running, at least in terms of your manipulations, your attention checks are working. And then if there are going to be changes that are made, they're made at that point. If you're not using a fail-safe in your pre-registration, you need to have some of that worked out, because I think just to not to the point where there's this tension, right, between how much you do ahead of time with pilot testing and looking at effects that kind of ends up defeating the point of open science, whereas you kind of just let's see what happens. What's the answer to this research question? But I do think when you're doing things in advance with some pilot testing, you're really looking at the manipulation checks, the attention checks, because you don't want to do all that work and then come to the end to find out that you're not, a majority of your participants weren't able to pass a very basic manipulation check. And so I think we can't abandon some of the practices we had before that were good. They should be used to complement the open science and the pre-registration in a way that just ensures that we're being more clear about what it is that we're doing ahead of time, where at what point we're going to stop and reevaluate and then continue science.
One kind of question I had just listening to that was that, I think it seems kind of clear that the open science movement is a lot more than just like procedures and practices, that it's really about an approach to science in general. And I'm wondering if you all have found that you conceptualize or go about your own research in different ways after adopting some of these principles and kind of being aligned with the open science mindset.
Absolutely.
We plan that dramatic pause to really this is a very important answer that Jen's about to give. No pressure.
I think what we've been saying all along is that engaging in open science practices makes you have to be very thoughtful and deliberate about the science that you're doing. And I think that having engaged in open science practices with my own research has made me a more thoughtful, detail-oriented scientist in a lot of ways. We think we've worked all of those things out, but like Anthony's example of trying to run the same data off of the pre-registration with his student, we don't necessarily always think through all those nuances ahead of time. And I think that the deeper you get into open science, the better you get at considering those nuances ahead of time. And it just, again, makes your entire science better.
Yeah, indeed. I find this is making me do the things that I thought science was all about anyway. The whole idea about the beauty of science being setting the rules ahead of time so that you can find out these answers in a more systematic way, and we weren't actually doing that as much as we had claimed we were. So it's really just more in line with what I thought I was doing and that we were all doing. It's just really just basically calling myself and calling ourselves out about, like, these are the things, if you really want to make sure that you have as much confidence in your work as possible, that you can stand behind it. What kinds of things are you going to do to make sure that your science is doing the talking, and rather than, anything that you did after the fact. So yeah, I think it really has helped. And I think Melanie had referenced this before, that it really just redistributes a lot of the work rather than adding a whole lot of extra work. It's the kind of things that we were thinking about already, but thinking about it at the front end rather than the back end, which for me at least, it has made running analysis and writing up papers all the more wonderful, of having that documented blueprint ahead of time, as opposed to going months later after collecting everything and then having a bunch of numbers in a data set and going, oh yeah, and what did I want to do with this? Having a blueprint document there has made that last process so much more efficient and exciting for me.
I think it's made me a better researcher for sure. It's kind of like I had the philosophy, and I don't know that it's a philosophy or just kind of a way of life, in terms of like, you're just really busy. Well, like, we'll figure that out later. Well, that's just not the way to do science, right? And I'm the first to admit that. And so I think it's helpful to be thoughtful, like Jen said, and to kind of think about these things ahead of time. And the time you spend in the front is only going to expedite things later on, which I think is good. And I will do a shameless plug kind of along this line of thinking for registered reports at Law and Human Behavior, which we started about a year ago after Jen put together the symposium at APLS. And I just think I would encourage everyone that's listening to think about doing a registered report. It is very similar to pre-registration. It's a little bit different, and you can find details on the website. But I think the people that have done it, the positive feedback we've gotten is, if you think about it, we've been doing things backwards. Like, you put all this energy and money and time into collecting data, and then you send it out, and then reviewer number 2, right, comes back with, well, but what about this, or what about that? All of that's handled at the front end. So by the time, you're ready to run the study, you've gotten feedback from reviewers, you've gotten a lot of that other, stuff out of the way, you've improved your study, and, it's guaranteed to publish as long as you do what you said you would do. And so I think it's an opportunity as you begin to work through this. I would like to see more registered reports at Law and Human Behavior. I think they're going to become increasingly common. And, that poses some interesting questions for us as an editorial team. What are we going to do with that? But in the meantime, I just would encourage you to do it. You're going to save yourself a lot of energy at the front end, to avoid going through doing a study and then just to get it rejected because of reviewer number 2.
Yeah, I think ultimately it's leading to a stronger science. And I think that's why I always find the commentary about the lack of incentive structure so interesting, such an interesting commentary, because shouldn't just doing better science be incentive enough? And I get, right, like, it takes more time, it takes more resources, you have to do a lot more work up front. If you're doing a registered report, you have to put it through some peer review before you do the study and all of those things. But ultimately, if it's leading to a stronger science, to me, that should be incentive enough to do it.
Wow, I learned so much from you guys. So we're now moving to the Q&A section too. So for the audience, please feel free to let us know if you have any questions. I mean, of course, we do have a lot of backup questions, but we really want to hear the question from the live audience. Okay, while we're waiting, I will go to our next backup question, which is more advanced. So we have touched down on this topic a little bit. So right now, one thing is that we really want to figure out whether there are more intelligent ways to present our work or endeavor that putting our own research work in regard to the open science, because we know that's a lot of work regarding that. So, and then like Anthony has mentioned that, for example, there might be some different ways we can present our CV. Or right now we're using the badges on the journals. So is there any like recommendations or any like smart design, like systematically, that we can change the way that to present our work in regard to the open science movement?
I think one change that I've seen recently is the use of like QR codes on poster presentations with links to like your OSF materials. I don't know if that's exactly answering your question. I might not understand your question, but that's something that I've seen recently that seems to be a change, is really like when you're at a poster session, being able to gather much more information than you would be able to gather in like a traditional poster by giving them a QR code to a link in OSF where you can, read a proposal or maybe a preprint, or see the materials and data and those kinds of things, is one change that you can make to, the next time you present your work. Just pop in a QR code. They're super easy to make. You can literally just type in like QR code generator on the internet and you'll find one. It's a way to really, I think it's a pretty small step that you can take towards, presenting your work in a different way to, incorporate open science practices.
Yeah, I mean, I would say another thing, you mentioned CVs, you can put those badges, for next to that article on your CV. Anthony and I both do that for our CVs, and they are hyperlinked to our OSF and SciArchive, data, materials, preprints, what have you, depending on what project they're associated with. But yeah, they're just little icons right next to the each line on the CV that they go with. So it's a quick, easy visual way of showing in there as well, like that you're doing these things and that it is, and you're making that stuff available to people as well that get your CV.
Yeah, I think part of the idea here is, refocusing the idea that there are way more tangible products that suggest your accomplishments and what you've done in research beyond the actual final journal article that's out there. So like Jen was mentioning, we include links to preprints when we submit something and we upload it. Those links are on the CV so that people can actually see what the work is. I know, especially as a grad student, being early in your CV, a lot of times there's sometimes this question of, do I have a manuscript in preparation kind of section? And there's a lot of discussion there about what is really in prep. Well, if you've actually done a study and you're writing it up, you can have a section. There's been recommendations, for example, of like a completed project section where the manuscript is still being written, but the study, just so you know, this is actually a study that has been done. It's been completed. Here's the pre-registration. And so now you have an actual tangible product for that study that you've done, and people can become more familiar with your work much more quickly.
Bradley, you want to say something about like this question?
Yeah, I was thinking about it. I'm not sure that I have a lot to add. I'm thinking about it in terms of how, because I'm obviously evaluating a lot more CVs than I am preparing them. And, I work on this with my students as well. But I think part of it is, and this point has been made, but I'll make it again, is that we need to educate our colleagues and our students to kind of create this culture of open science so that so that I'm not having to kind of just count badges, which I think is important. And I really think Jen's idea of hyperlinking that to the actual presentation. She's much more technologically sophisticated than I am. I think that's super cool. But I think part of it is to me, talking to other committee members about we can't just reduce this to counting publications anymore. I mean, we need to look at what is this person, how are they implementing science, how are they practicing science? Because, I think to some degree the rest will take care of itself. And so I think I like your question about how we bring that to people's attention, but I think some of the onus is also on us, right? The evaluators, whether we're on a hiring committee or a reviewer, to look for that stuff and to be able to recognize open science when we see it, even if it's not in the form of a badge or an acceptance.
Yeah, and you see every once in a while there are hints that this is definitely accessible and people are open to considering this. If you look at when you apply for at least for a number of different tenure track jobs, when they ask for application materials, sometimes they'll ask for some of your research, and a lot of times they'll have that you can have works in progress in there. Well, if you have a preprint ready of a study that may be under review but hasn't been accepted yet, that's an example of a finished product there that you can have to share people and share your scholarship with. And all these things, the more that you share about your work with people, the more they're going to remember it, and the more they're going to be familiar with you. There's a difference between somebody knowing the topic area that you are interested in, or that you did a presentation at APLS, versus if you had a link to the actual slides and the APLS presentation that you did, and all of a sudden they now see the study, they see what you did, they remember that study much better. Some people will, maybe some other people won't remember it, but the idea is it only helps in that situation. It helps be a little bit more familiar with your work, which increases their familiarity with you.
And we have a question from the audience. So someone asks, from an undergraduate student, how is this something I can implement at my university where it isn't common practice?
We're all doing rock, paper, scissors, so I lost. I'll go.
Yeah.
I think just start practicing it yourself, right? I mean, I think to be a role model and to look for for other students in your department, and if there aren't faculty that are practicing open science, to use some of these other resources that Jen and Anthony and Melanie have pointed to, and to kind of be a leader, lead by example, but start practicing that yourself. And it's I think a good way to get other people interested, to ask questions, and to just to start learning how to do it. I think that it's intimidating for all of us, right? I think that it's in some ways it's added a new layer to imposter syndrome that I think we all struggle with. It's like, okay, not only do I have to pretend to be a scientist, I've got to pretend to be an open scientist, and I don't even know how to do that. And I just think it's for me, it was very liberating, and it in the back of your head, but to kind of see it, that other people's science isn't perfect either. And for me, it was not like, it just was the opposite of a burden. It was like a release and a relief to know, and that really is what science is about. So I would say, I got a little off topic there towards the end, but I'm sorry. So I would say, do open science yourself, and if there aren't people to help you with it, reach out to us or reach out to some of these resources, and be that role model for your other undergraduate students, and maybe even some of your faculty.
I think that's another good point to plug Jen's link for SIPS. I think SIPS is a really good conference for students. So if you want to just learn more about open science, even if you don't have the opportunity to do it where you are necessarily, just teaching yourself about it. And SIPS is, I think, $5 registration for undergraduate students and graduate students. So even just taking opportunities like that where you can meet more people who are interested in open science and learning about it is a way that you could do that.
Yeah, and I mean, there's nothing stopping you, for example. So obviously, there's different types of research that you're going to be involved in at the undergraduate level. Sometimes you are a research assistant on someone else's project. So obviously, you can't tell them you must implement open science because it's not your project. But you could go and say, hey, I'd really like to learn how to do pre-registration. Can I help you with it? And then you're potentially opening that door to them to learn about what that is without putting any sort of pressure or onus on them to have to do it. Or for your own projects, let's say you're doing an undergraduate thesis project, telling your mentor, I want to pre-register this before I collect my data. That's your project at that point, so you should be able to do that. So there might be different ways of kind of approaching it depending on the type of project that you're working on as well.
Yeah, it's definitely about just being open and communicating. So if you are familiar and you want to work on this, and if you want to do any kind of pre-registration for a thesis, as the example, and you have a mentor there that you trust. You can ask them if what their thoughts are on doing this, that you would like to do this for your work. And if they're unfamiliar with it, you have the resources to show them. It's a lot of the things that we talk about right now, but we're just documenting it ahead of time. And I would be optimistic that they would be on board with it, especially if you're saying, like, I would take the lead in this. And then from there, the little things, like if you do your thesis and there is a presentation of that work, during your presentation, you can put the little open science badges and just kind of note what you did ahead of time, and just get people familiar with it, that you had kind of documented all these things on a fixed server ahead of time and had planned this analysis well in advance. And getting people to just think about these different practices, and just make it as matter of fact as you're presenting your work, that this is essentially part of the methodology, and getting people more familiar with that way.
So, like, we have a last question to conclude our conversation today. So we know that we have like a similar conversation last year in New Orleans before the COVID. And then right now we're having this conversation this year. And then I know that most of us will meet again, like in-person conference, like maybe APLS. So I'm wondering that, like, for you guys, do you have any like milestone, like 1 year goal, like before, for example, like next year's APLS that you can share with us?
I don't know what projects I'll be working on this year. It really depends on when our institution will let us do in-person research again.
Good point.
I would love for us to be able to share with you the data that we've collected on open science in psychology and law by next year. I think that we're probably on track to have that, so we can really start talking about what the barriers are, and how just cataloging how many people are doing this and what people are doing. If we could have that done by next year's APLS, that would be wonderful. And hopefully we're on that track.
And that's really just Melanie's attempt to try and keep me, like, give me a deadline to have, like, McAuliffe, I told everybody that was listening to this that we would have the data. Where is it? So I think
it's recorded.
Yeah, exactly. It's memorialized here. I
appreciate Amy to ask me that question for this reason.
Melanie was in the audience typing that in the chat there. I want to just continue to see growth, right? I mean, you hope the overall slope is positive. There's going to be peaks and valleys along the way, but I think just continuing, I really appreciate the opportunity for us to talk about this, because I think one of the things that disappointed is too strong of a word, but our organization has a lot of money, right? And we have some of the brightest people that I know on the executive committee and just in our discipline. And I'm kind of surprised, and this actually goes to APA as well. We had the new science director talking about science and talked about, I think, 8 initiatives and didn't mention open science once. And I'm not saying it should be the end all be all, but it needs to be at the table, right? And so I think that I'd like to see a year from now, our executive committee and our research subcommittee help, start to incentivize with grants and with opportunities, more open science research. Because I think once people do it, and there'll be a little bit of a struggle, but once you get through that, they'll be hooked and they'll be committed to doing open, good science for the rest of their careers. And so I'd like to see our organization incentivize that a little more.
One of my long-term goals for APLS is to get at least a couple of hackathons, inspired by SIPs, into the conference, where we can do things like work together as a field on implementing standards and guidelines for how we want to do things like open science. I don't know if that's a realistic goal for this next year, but it is definitely a long-term goal of something that I would really like to see APLS implement as well.
Well, this was so wonderful. And when we asked the question about milestones a year from now, I'm like, we could all be in person a year from now. It seems crazy to think about, but fingers crossed for all of that. So just in kind of wrapping up, I think some of the key points that stood out to me that I think, or I hope, everyone can sort of take with them as we close out this webinar, is that this is really a learning process for all of us, and we've come a long way, but there's definitely a lot more work that we all can do, no matter what stage we're in of our education or professional career. There's something we all can do to contribute. That open science is not a all or nothing practice, that just taking small steps and implementing something is a step in the right direction. And really that open science is also about inclusion on sort of all fronts. So those were some of the things that really stood out to me that I hope folks can take with them. And we just, again, wanted to extend a really big thank you to all of our attendees, and big thank you to our panelists for this amazing discussion and for sharing your expertise and insights and opinions, and for letting us learn about the really cool work that you're all doing. And for those who were here and want to rewatch parts of this or check out some of those resources, the webinar will be available on the APLS Student Committee website. And if anyone is interested in future events, please follow us on Twitter at APLSSC, follow us on Instagram at APLS Students, and follow us on Facebook at APLS.SC. But yeah, and if panelists, you could hang on for a second, we'd like to take a group picture if that's okay. But thank you again to everyone for coming.
Thank you.